Hi students, welcome to Easy Elimu Learning Simplified. My name is Mbide, and in this session, we are going to learn about oral literature and specifically introduce ourselves to oral narratives. We will define what oral narratives are, give a few characteristics, general characteristics of oral narratives, and also name or state the different types of oral narratives. So what is an oral narrative? This is a story that gives an account of people, events, or a place. Remember, like narrative essays, we now have oral narratives. To narrate is to tell a story. So these are stories told about people, events, or places. So an oral narrative may be factual. That means that it is a true story. It is something real that happened. Or it may be fictional, which means it is not a true story. It is made up. It has imaginary people, imaginary events, imaginary places. For example, the Ogre stories, we can say that they are imaginary or they are fictional. And so oral narratives are handed down from generation to generation by word of mouth. So maybe you visit your grandparents and they narrate to you a story. And then when you become a parent, you narrate the same story to your children. When your children become parents, they narrate that story to their children, and it goes on and on. So they are handed down from one generation to another by the word of mouth because they are oral, they are narrated orally. So what are some general characteristics of oral narratives? Number one is that the plot is very simple or very linear. So remember we said the plot is the order of events in a story. And so the plot can be divided into three. The plot of an oral narrative can be divided into three. We start at the beginning where it starts. So here the audience is introduced to the characters and the problems facing the characters. And then we go to the middle, which is where the narration takes place and the audience hears the various attempts made by the characters to solve the different problems that they encounter. And lastly, the ending, the audience hears about the problems being solved. So those are the three parts of a plot of an oral narrative. Another characteristic of oral narrative is that oral narratives have relevant characters. Characters are people who carry the story. They don't have to be people. They can also be things. They can be animals. They don't necessarily have to be people because again, in ogre stories, there may be characters that are people, but there's also the character that is an ogre, and an ogre is not a person. So if you ever find yourself narrating an oral narrative, ensure that the characters you use are relevant. Another major characteristic of oral narratives is that they use a rural setup. Remember that oral narratives are giving stories from a long time ago. So most likely they're using a rural setup, and you can see this by some of the activities that you'll see happening. For example, going to the river to fetch water. We don't do that in the urban centers because we have tap water. But in the rural setup, even now, there are some rural areas where you have to go to the river to fetch water. You have to go to the forest to collect firewood. These are some of the things or activities that you can see in an oral narrative. For example, going to hunt, it is something that is seen in oral narratives. So, and also the setting, maybe the houses are huts, they are organized in villages. Another thing about oral narratives is that they have a moral lesson. One major role of oral narratives is to educate. So someone may narrate a story to you, and then at the end ask you, so what have you learned from this? So one, our role is to educate the audience. Oral narratives also encourage virtues like honesty, kindness, selflessness, and they discourage vices like jealousy, greed, dishonesty, theft. So they are geared towards passing down good moral values. Oral narrative are also timeless, and that means that they are not affected by the passing of time. So the main events will remain the same even when the story is told over and over again. Even if the story is told 20 years later, the events will remain as they were, the characters will remain as they were. So they are not affected by time. They are not time specific. That's why the opening formula, which we learn when we go deep into oral narratives, you find that the opening formula or how it starts will be once upon a time or long time ago. So they don't give a specific time. So what are some of the stylistic devices that are used in oral narratives? Remember, we said that style is the creative use of language. So some of the stylistic devices include an opening formula. So one way to know that this is an oral narrative is the opening formula, once upon a time, a long time ago, story come. That is an opening formula. And the opening formula will tell us who is the narrator, the person that says once upon a time, that is the storyteller. The opening formula also calls the audience to attention. So when you hear that, you know now it is time to listen to the story. So it calls the audience to attention. It also signifies that this is the beginning of the story. Once upon a time, this is where the story begins. And lastly, it also moves the audience from the world of reality to the world of fantasy. We know now it is story time, so we go to the world of fantasy. It takes our imagination to the world of fantasy. And so because an oral narrative has an opening formula, it most definitely also has a closing formula. So once the story is told and it is over, there could be a closing statements like, and they lived happily ever after, or and the ogre was finally killed and stopped terrorizing the residents. So such a phrase, the closing formula, signifies that the story has come to an end. It closes the story. It ends the story. And it also takes the audience back now from the world of fantasy back to reality. Now the story is over. Let us go back now to real life. Another stylistic device used in oral narratives is repetition. So repetition is important for emphasis. Maybe if you are narrating a story to people and you say, the house was very, 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 very dirty. That repetition of the word very, it is to emphasize how dirty was this house. Extremely dirty. So repetition is good for emphasis. Another stylistic device is circumlocution, which is the use of many words instead of a single word or instead of few words. So let's say you're narrating a story and then you say, that son of my mother stole my phone. You see the word, the son of my mother, 4 words, instead of just saying, my brother stole my phone. So it also makes the story a bit interesting. So it is allowed to use, many words instead of one word. Hyperbole is also another stylistic device that is used in oral narratives. And hyperbole simply refers to exaggeration, to exaggerate something. You're trying to say something, but you exaggerate. And it is used so as to emphasize something. and it can be used mostly in monster stories where events are not real. So you can, maybe you're talking about, I don't know, a hyena that has attacked a house where people live, and you say how it pounced onto the roof and brought the roof down and brought all the windows down. You emphasis, exaggeration, it emphasizes how bad that attack by the hyena was. So it is important. It is also for that emphasis, and also makes the story more interesting to read and makes your audience more curious to listen to you. Songs are also used in oral narratives. Number one, to break monotony, because you're talking too much, you're narrating something. To break that monotony, to engage your audience, you may sing a song that is related to whatever it is that you're narrating, and also a song that your audience can sing, your audience can join in and sing with you because it is well known to them. So the songs encourage the audience to be active and join in the singing. So maybe somebody who was starting to doze off and they hear the audience singing, they're going to join in the singing, and that will bring back their attention to your story. It also brings out some emotional relief. Maybe the story you're narrating is a bit tense. A song will bring some form of relief. And songs can also be a form of communication between characters, between your characters. Another device used in oral narratives is dialogue. Dialogue is direct communication of two characters or more. And it makes the narrative more interesting, because if you're narrating a story and you want to maybe bring in a dialogue between two people or two characters, as a narrator, you're going to change your voice when you're talking. When you're quoting character one and character two, there will be tonal variation for the different characters, and that makes the story interesting and it makes it more relatable. So if maybe the character that is talking here is maybe a hyena and you talk like one, and you see now, first of all, that is personification, which we will learn about later. So dialogue makes the story more interesting. So another device is the use of idiophones and onomatopoeia. So before we give examples, let us define what are idiophones and what is onomatopoeia. And so an idiophone is a word made up by the narrator to give the audience an idea of a real sound. They are not part of a vocabulary of a language. For example, when you say, the old woman screamed in pain, ooh-wee. The word ooh-wee is an idiophone because it is not a real word. When you go to the dictionary, you can't find such a word. But you can use it in narratives to emphasize whatever it is that you're trying to say, to emphasize how painful was it for this woman to scream. And then onomatopoeic words are part of vocabulary and of real language. So that's the difference between onomatopoeia and idiophones. So idiophones are not real words, onomatopoeia are real words. For example, the water swished into the tank. So instead of just saying you put water into the tank, you say the water swished. So you make the language more interesting. Narrators can also use figurative language like similes and metaphors. For example, now similes are used to make comparison using words like or as. For example, when you say Muga ate like a hyena at the party, or Muga ate as greedily as a hyena at the party. That is a simile. You are relating one character to another. So how was Muga eating? As greedily as what? What is greedily? Hyenas. And then metaphors are expressions that make a comparison between two things which are not similar, where one thing is being said to be another. For example, with the same example, during the party, Muga was a hyena. So because we know the character of a hyena, we know that this person means that Muga was eating greedily. So instead of comparing, like in similes where you say as greedily as a hyena, you can just say Muga was a hyena. And that brings out the vivid description. You're able to have a mental picture of how Muga was eating. Narrators can also use proverbs to emphasize their point or to pass the moral of the narrative, the moral of the story. And symbolism is also another stylistic device that is used in narratives. And this is using symbolic characters and items. For example, hyenas are used to symbolize greed. So when you say Muga was a hyena, that is symbolic, to symbolize that he was greedy. When you use maybe lions are used to show bravery. So symbolism also brings out emphasis of whatever it is that you're trying to say. And lastly, we have personification. And personification is the use of an expression in which an inanimate object or idea is given human qualities and abilities. Inanimate is something that is not human. So for example, fear held me by the shoulders and shook me vigorously. Fear is not a human being. Fear does not have hands, right? But when you say fear held me by the shoulders, you're giving it human qualities or human characters. And this also is a way of emphasizing how scared were you? How much fear did you have? So when somebody reads, fear held me by the shoulders and shook me vigorously, they can tell that you are really, really scared. So that's it for introduction to oral narratives. I hope you have understood. And for further practice, you can have a look at the quiz. In subsequent videos, we will look at these narratives one by one. So discuss 6 characters of oral narratives. Discuss 4 stylistic devices used in oral narratives. Thank you for tuning in and see you in the next session.